Thank you all for attending today. Today, our Renegade Labs new leader, Corey Wolf, will be going through how pen testing helps meet industry standards and reduce risk. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to ask in the question section, and we'll get it to those at the end of the presentation and when we start doing our QA process. We actually have like a document that Corey will be covering during the presentation that you can actually download in the handout section. And please, like I said, please feel free to ask as many questions as you like. Corey, you go ahead and take it from here.
Sounds good. Thank you, Corey. So as Corey Brown had mentioned, my name is Corey Wolf. I'm the Director of Offensive Security here at Risk 360. So what does that mean? That means that my team is responsible for all of the penetration testing, social engineering, red teaming, purple teaming, adversary emulation, all that kind of stuff, items that you would consider to be offensive security, right? I've been involved in technology and security and development in some way or another for the past 20 plus years, and joined Risk 360 back in April, and it's been a pleasure to be here, and I'm happy that you are all here with me today, right? So looking forward to talking about some things today. So first and foremost, for those of you that don't know who we are, Risk 360 is a boutique professional services firm. So we provide services related to vCISO. We do a lot of SOC 2 and ISO work, do quite a bit of PCI work as well. Of course, today, what we're talking about today is what we do, a lot of penetration testing. We do web application testing, red teaming, purple teaming, that kind of thing. If you are unfamiliar with us and interested in learning more, please feel free to go to risk360.com. You can learn more about who we are, our core values, what we do, the type of services we offer, all that kind of stuff, if you visit us at risk360.com. So that's us in a nutshell. So what are we going to be talking about today? So our agenda is really going to focus on four primary areas. So that's penetration testing and risk, compliance and regulations, identifying and mitigating risk, and then we'll talk about continuous testing and how that can kind of relieve some of the burden when it comes to risk management programs and security programs in general. We'll also talk a little bit about how we can help you with that and open it up to Q&A. So as Corey had mentioned, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them into the chat as we go along, and then we can get to them towards the end there. So yeah, let's start it off, right? So penetration testing and risk, right? So why does it matter? What does it have to do with the risk management strategy? What does it have to do with the security program in general? The two have a pretty tight relationship, actually, because penetration testing does identify technical risks and in some cases process risks. So if you think about things like physical penetration testing, where we attempt to gain access to a on-site facility, right? Typically, with that unearths our process risks, right? And we'll go a little bit more in depth into the difference between technical and a process risk and those kinds of things in just a few minutes here. But I just want to give a quick overview for those of you that don't know what a penetration test is. So I think it's important that we set some ground rules here as far as what is a penetration test. Very often, penetration test gets mixed up with a vulnerability assessment. So they're not the same thing, right? A vulnerability assessment is something that's typically done with some sort of tooling. So the popular ones are Nessus and Qualys, right? It's a piece of software that performs scans and identifies software and services in your network, right? And so it can identify, which hosts are running Windows XP, right? Or Windows 10. It can identify HTTP servers and the different software that is running on those hosts. When it does that, it's then saying, okay, we know that this is, SSH version 2. Well, it's not like, that's not a specific version, but example's sake, we know it's SSH version 2, and we have this list of known vulnerabilities. And so if we go and we look SSH version 2, we could say, well, this particular version of this piece of software has these known vulnerabilities in it, right? Compiles a list, generates a report, and spits it out, right? And so there's value in that, don't get me wrong, but there's a big difference between that and a penetration test, right? The big difference is that in a penetration test, there is active exploitation. So that means that we will identify vulnerabilities, misconfigurations, things of that sort, risks, right? We will identify these risks and we will actually attempt to exploit them. So we will actually attempt to gain access to that server or that user account, whatever it might be, that web application. We will actually attempt to exploit it, because there's a big difference between having a vulnerability there, and this is something we'll talk about even more as we go through the next 45 minutes to an hour or so, but there's a big difference between a vulnerability being there and an attacker actually being able to execute it. That doesn't take into account things like access controls, doesn't take into account things like host-based protections that might be in place. It doesn't really add context. So just because a vulnerability is there, it may or may not be able to be exploited, right? And at the end of the day, that's really what you're concerned about, is whether or not it can be exploited. And so a penetration test provides a much better look into the security posture of the organization, right? Because we are acting like threat actors, we are acting like attackers, we are identifying vulnerabilities, and we are actively exploiting them, right? And from there, we can demonstrate impact, right? So we were able to do this, which then allowed us to do Y, whatever it might be. It's a penetration test is also a part of the proactive security puzzle. So you'll see a table there, proactive and reactive. You may hear this mentioned throughout the internet about the difference between proactive and reactive security. So proactive is exactly what it sounds like. These are actions that you take before there is an incident, essentially, right? So it's things like security awareness training, where you use something like KnowBe4 to send out phishing emails, right? And if the user clicks on the email, they get sent to a video that they watch, and they learn about security, right? So that's security awareness training. That's something that happens before an incident occurs. Penetration testing is one of those as well. So the idea is that we can be proactive in our defense of the organization by taking an offensive approach to it, right? So it's a proactive service. Some other ones that you'll see: threat hunting. I also listed there attack surface and asset management. So I listed those because if you do not have a solid understanding of what assets are in your environment, how can you be expected to defend against threats to them, right? So a proactive approach starts with the baseline of having a good asset inventory and being able to understand what do we truly have in our infrastructure, what is facing externally, so what is facing the greater internet, and where is it? How do we control it? Who owns it? Where does it live, right? That's the fundamental part of any security program, right? Reactive, exactly what it sounds like. So this is what happens if there is an incident. EDR, endpoint detection and response. That's the new age word for antivirus. That would be considered a reactive service. Say there's an incident, you use EDR to isolate machines, to shut down network traffic, that kind of thing. And then, of course, incident response, digital forensics, and then things like disaster recovery plans. They come into play after an incident has occurred, right? So at the end of the day, how do penetration testing and risk management work together? So really what you're doing with penetration testing is you're identifying vulnerabilities and risks. Because we're not doing just a vulnerability assessment, we're doing a penetration test, we can then provide context to these vulnerabilities, right? And score them appropriately because we actually tried to exploit this, right? There's more context there, there's more understanding of it. And it should serve as, these vulnerabilities or these risks that are identified should serve as additional data points throughout the whole risk management process, right? So it shouldn't be the be all end all. It should be one piece of that overall process of measuring and assessing risk. Of course, it fulfills compliance requirements as well, which we'll get much more into detail in just a few minutes on that. But the one thing I did want to call out is that I believe that this is too often overlooked about penetration testing, is that it does validate controls in ROI. So if you ask for a budget of X dollars to implement a firewall, for example, you can use penetration testing to validate that control, right? And so you can say, well, hey, the money that we spent here, the budget that we put towards this firewall or towards this control or whatever it might be, we had a real team of penetration testers come in. They did everything they could to bypass it, to break it, to get around it. They couldn't. So that money that we spent, that budget that we spent, was well worth it, right? So it's a way to validate those controls and really take a look at the ROI of the budget that you're spending on cybersecurity and risk management programs. I think too often that's overlooked, right? And it's a way for you to move forward and say, hey, this did work, it was worth the money. Now we need to do this, right? And move on with your process of working through, the financial aspects and things of that nature of, working through a security program. So recently, our CTO, Kevin Ketz, put on a webinar called The Business Case for Penetration Testing. If you're looking for a little bit more information into how that works and really what happens with the different penetration tests that are available to you and how to build a business case for them, I'd suggest that you take a look at that and check out his video and his white paper. That'd be extremely helpful. In that, he goes a little bit more in depth than I just did as far as penetration testing goes. He talks about the specific types, how to prepare, and of course how to build a business case for them for your organization. So I highly recommend that you check that out and you take a look at that video or that white paper. So let's talk about compliance. Compliance and regulations, right? So there are many different, depending on your industry, there are many different regulations that you might have to follow. And there are many different types of compliance requirements that you might have, right? So I think what we should do here is maybe walk through a couple of them, and we'll talk about how penetration testing and these particular aspects of risk and regulation work together. The first one that I would mention is PCI DSS. So for those of you that are not familiar, PCI DSS is Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. This is a standard that was developed by the credit card companies, so Visa, MasterCard, et cetera, which sets the tone and sets the standard for how entities that handle credit card payment data, how these entities manage and maintain their technology in their infrastructure, right? So in order to handle credit card data at all, you need to be PCI certified. And part of that process is going through a number of different technical evaluations, right? So if you look at the PCI standard, you'll see that they specifically call out a couple of different penetration tests. So they call out an internal and an external penetration test. So everything when it comes to PCI is specific to what's called the card data environment. So the CDE. The CDE is where actual card data lives and is stored and is transferred, right? And so from a PCI perspective, what they want to know is, can an attacker from an external perspective gain access to the CDE environment, right? Are they able to bypass a router or some sort of edge device and gain access to the CDE environment? That's one aspect of it. For the internal portion of it, PCI requires that your CDE, machines, networks, et cetera, are separated from the rest of your corporate environment, internal environment. So in that case, what they want to know is if you are on the standard corporate environment, the day-to-day corporate environment, can you access that CDE environment somehow? So for us, that translates to an internal penetration test. And so when you do penetration tests, there's typically focus areas. In the case of PCI, one of the focus areas would be that card data environment. So if we are internal on your network and we're attempting to perform, and we are performing a penetration test, we will say, hey, can we get into that CDE, right? Can we get into that card holder, that card data environment? The other one is application layer testing. So in the real world, this typically translates to web application. So if you have a web application that's accepting credit card payments, PCI requires that has a penetration test against it, right? So just to even, be PCI certified, you need to be doing these things. And lastly, segmentation testing. So if we go back to the idea of the CDE environment, this means that the virtual LANs, right? So this is actual network segmentation, that the virtual LANs are separate, right? So this means that if you have a host, if you have 5 hosts, right, that are handling cardholder data, and they live on one particular subnet, this means, can we, from outside of that subnet, get into it, and vice versa? If we are in that subnet, can we get out of it, right? There's a little bit more in depth as far as the specifics go of PCI and segmentation testing, but essentially that's what it's saying, is that from a network architecture perspective, these subnets and these hosts need to be separate from all the other network segments. And so you go in and you do what's called network segmentation testing, and you see, can we get in? If we're in there, can we get out? Right. So just to even, be PCI certified, you have to be doing these specific types of penetration testing. The other one that we talk about often here at Risk 360 is ISO 27001. So I will call out that it is not explicitly required. So ISO does not specifically say that you need to perform penetration testing. There's a couple controls here that relate to that. So if you ISO has Appendix A, which calls out some of these specific things. But if you look at, for example, Control 12.6.1, it's called the management of technical vulnerabilities, right? And it says information about technical vulnerabilities shall be obtained in a timely fashion, the organization's exposure to such vulnerabilities evaluated, and appropriate measures taken to address the associated risk. So if you're going through ISO, if you're looking to get certified, or you're already certified and you need to perform an audit, I would speak with, if you work with us, we do lots of ISO work, I would speak with your consultant to see specifically what that means for you as an organization, because depending on your situation, that may require a vulnerability scan, may require a vulnerability assessment, but ultimately, if you perform a penetration test, this is going to satisfy that requirement. So often what you'll see is organizations say, hey, we want to make sure that we cover this aspect. Why don't we just do a penetration test? The other one that I would call out is a new one from 2022, ISO 27001, the 2022 version. If you look at Control 8.16, you'll see monitoring activities. This is the only place where they actually write out penetration tests, and they're talking about security monitoring. And they give recommendations about how it can be enhanced. And so you'll see there that I included a little snippet of that particular control. But it talks about how security monitoring can be enhanced. They give recommendations, and of course they say vulnerability assessments, penetration tests, cyber attack simulations, and cyber response exercises. So with ISO, while it's not specifically called out, it is, it could make your life easier to simply just do a penetration test, because you know that you're going to be able to fulfill those requirements using a penetration test, right? Moving on to high trust. So high trust refers to this as a technical security configuration compliance review. And so I've noted some specific sections of the high trust CSF where the CSF specifically talks about it. But as you can see, there is a section there, technical vulnerability management. So to reduce the risk resulting, technical vulnerability management shall be implemented in an effective, systematic, and repeatable way, right? And then if you also look at the second bullet there, the organization performs annual checks on the technical security configuration of systems, either manually by an individual with experience or the assistance of automated software tools. Again, in order to fulfill these types of requirements, a penetration test is absolutely going to do that. So this is often what you see, and high trust does require that you perform a penetration test, but in their wording, it's referred to as a technical security configuration compliance review. There it is. So again, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat there, and we'll get to them later on. But moving on to some regulations. So most of us are familiar with GDPR. So again, in this case, while this is not specifically called out, while penetration testing is not specifically called out, as you can see, Article 32 of GDPR does call out a process for regularly testing, assessing, and evaluating the effectiveness of technical and organizational measures. So, penetration test absolutely is going to fulfill that. And over here, if we go stateside, we talk about the CCPA. So that's the California Consumer Protection Act, which is, to boil it down, it's the California's version of the GDPR. They do not specifically call it penetration testing, but they do call out that there is a specific requirement that the business institute reasonable security procedures and practices to protect the personal information of California residents in this case. So again, while not specifically calling out penetration testing is the way to really fulfill these requirements, lowering the lift from your risk management program by simply performing a penetration test and knowing and having the peace of mind to know that this is going to fulfill these different areas. One area that we don't necessarily talk about too much is the FDA. So this one I think is interesting. A mentor of mine was very forward-thinking on this many years ago, and the FDA recently updated the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So if you are a medical device manufacturer, or if you work in the medical device ecosystem, you now have much more stringent cybersecurity requirements, which are spelled out in the updated Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Essentially, what the FDA is doing now is, in the past, the wording was there that organizations had to perform cybersecurity. I forget exactly what it says, but it was very, very broad, right? And so with this new update to the FDA Act or FTC Act, they're starting to become more specific. And so their wording is becoming more specific. And over time, I do believe that this is going to get more and more strict as far as the FDA requirements in cybersecurity. But this is, I believe, kind of just the first round of them updating this guidance. Well, not guidance. This regulation, and they really call out that manufacturers must be able to offer reasonable assurance that the device is cyber secure. Well, how do you do that, right? It's a penetration test, right? Or in this case, if you're talking specifically about medical device manufacturers, that's more of hardware penetration testing. But at the end of the day, it's a penetration test, right? And that second bullet point there calls out an SBOM. So that's a software bill of materials. And so that relates to application security. So a software bill of materials, for those of you that don't know, lists out all the components of a particular device's platform. So this means that in the case of medical devices, that you need to know which, so if the medical device was built with Java, for example, you need to know every single Java package that is going into your application. You need to know every single piece of hardware that is going into your device. You need to know where they were manufactured, if they have any known vulnerabilities, but you need to have a full software bill of materials right now. I believe the FDA gave a little bit of leeway, in that many manufacturers aren't necessarily going to have to, I believe they provide a grace period until October of this year. And I believe this act was updated in March. So yeah, it's getting more and more strict. And one of the ways that if you're a medical device manufacturer that you can comply with these particular regulations is by having a strong cyber security program which implements penetration testing. It's going to help you fulfill these compliance requirements and these different regulations that you see. So that was just a brief overview of some of the compliance requirements and some of the regulations. Let's talk about consequences of non-compliance. So we started off talking about PCI DSS and how if you want to handle or process credit card data, you need to be PCI compliant. If you are not PCI compliant, Visa and MasterCard and the other credit card companies will not work with you. You simply will not be able to interact with those platforms. You will not be able to interact with those systems. You will lose the ability to process credit card payments and handle credit card data if you lose your PCI compliance. The other one is revenue loss, which again, I think that this is maybe one that's not touched on too often, but especially in the enterprise environment, if you are a vendor for another organization, just say it's a Fortune 500 organization, right? These big enterprises, and a decent amount of small and medium-sized ones as well, but especially these big enterprise organizations have third-party risk management programs. And so what that means is that they vet all of their vendors that they use, and they require that all the vendors that they use meet certain requirements, right? And so they might require that all their vendors undergo annual penetration tests. They might require that all their vendors are ISO 27001 certified, for example. So if you lose that ISO or you lose that PCI, you could possibly lose that business with that organization because you're not fulfilling the requirements of their third-party risk management program. So it could lead to revenue loss. And of course, reputational damage. So we talked a little bit about high trust and PCI and ISO. And part of what these certifications do is they give brand awareness to the public that, hey, we are secure. We've taken security measures above and beyond, and we are ISO certified, which is essentially a stamp of approval in the eyes of a consumer or another business if you're doing B2B sales. Same thing with high trust. That shows that you know what you're talking about, you know what you're doing, and you are a reasonably secure business. So if you lose that certification, that could lead to some reputational damage or more marketing effects than anything. So if we talk about actually identifying and mitigating risk, so a penetration test is going to identify risks. It's going to identify a couple different risks, and especially here at Risk 360, but most penetration testing firms are going to provide recommendations to mitigate that risk. So, while you're actually identifying these particular issues, it's important to have a good mitigation strategy, right? And to understand, okay, this is a problem, but how do I fix it, right? You never want to, so for us as an offensive security service line, we don't want to just provide, hey, you have a bunch of problems, right? We want to provide information to help you mitigate those problems. And we want to be your partner to help you move that along to mitigate those risks. And so all organizations that provide penetration testing should, and most of them do, provide recommendations to actually mitigate that risk. So earlier I mentioned two types of risks. There's really two, when it comes to penetration testing, it's going to identify two types of risks. It's going to identify the technical risk. And so what is a technical risk? That could be a vulnerability in a piece of software. So going back to our SSH example, SSH2 is vulnerable to buffer overflow, right? That's a technical risk. A technical risk is also a misconfiguration. So in this case, the example I'm giving is AWS S3 buckets with allow all. So that means that, this is what happened with Capital One many years back. But Capital One had a cloud storage bucket that was exposed to the internet, which was basically allowing all access. So you did not need to be authenticated or authorized to access this information. And so that's what happened with Capital One. I think it happened with Experian too. I think that was the situation. But essentially what happens is that you put your storage out for the internet for anyone to see and access, right? And that happens because there's a misconfiguration in your cloud architecture. So that's actually a technical risk, but it's a misconfiguration of certain services. The other example is Azure conditional access. So many organizations use conditional access policies to restrict how and when people can log into their Microsoft tenant. And so, for example, they might have a conditional access policy that says only allow users from the United States from this IP to log into their Microsoft Azure AD account, right? And so if you're in Canada and you try to log in, Microsoft just won't even let you do it, right? Or anywhere else. So you're not within that IP range, Microsoft will not let you log in. But it's common for these types of misconfigurations to occur, especially in enterprise environments. So think about if you're a big organization and you have 10, 20, 50, 100 physical locations, and you want to implement some sort of conditional access policy like that, that means that you have to include all of those locations' IP addresses, which easily, and I've seen it before, easily means that you could have a typo somewhere. And I've actually seen them where, so if you understand what CIDR notation is, there's /8/16, and it's basically a shorthand way to write out a bunch of IP addresses. And in one instance that I've seen, the organization was implementing conditional access controls, but instead of putting, I believe they were supposed to put a /24, they put a /16, which basically opened up that rule to half of I'm not going to mention the city, but it's a major city in the US, millions of people live there. It opened up that conditional access policy to about half of that city. So millions of people, just by putting a /16 instead of /24, right? Those are misconfigurations. And a combination of the two, as well. So mixing known vulnerabilities with misconfigurations, in some cases, in order to execute known vulnerabilities or exploit known vulnerabilities, certain misconfigurations may need to be in place, right? So that's a technical risk. The other side of that is a process risk. So if we think about what Kevin Ketz, our CTO, again, I would suggest you go and look at his white paper or his video about the webinar that he did on this. But if you look at the different types of penetration testing, it really boils down to a couple, right? So there's network penetration testing, there's cloud penetration testing, and there's physical penetration testing. So, with physical penetration testing, most of the risks that you identify are actually process risks. They're not technical vulnerabilities. And so what I mean by that is that, for example, if you're doing a physical penetration test and you are able to just walk in past the entrance desk of a physical location, just walk into the office and sit down at a computer or sit down at a desk, that's a process risk. There's no sign-up procedure for vendors or visitors or anything like that. You're not taking an inventory of who's going in, who's going out, where are they from, what company are they from, do they have an appointment, those types of things. That's a process risk. Another one is a unclear communication policy. So God forbid there is some sort of incident and you have to enact your incident response plan. What if your incident response plan calls out Microsoft Teams as your primary communication channel, but your Microsoft tenant is just totally locked down? What do you do now, right? So clearly that's a process risk. You probably shouldn't set Microsoft Teams as your primary communication channel in that case, because if you have an incident and you're an organization, you're probably using Microsoft in some way, and if your tenant gets compromised in any way, well, that communication channel goes down the drain, and you don't have any real ways to combat this incident. Another one is an undefined process for isolating machines. So say there is an incident and there's a host on the network that your EDR, CrowdStrike, Carbon Black, SentinelOne, whatever it might be, says, hey, there's a piece of malware on this machine. And you know that you need to isolate that machine as an incident responder, but you're not really sure what the process is. So I've seen this before as well, to where, especially in enterprise organizations, to where there's a security team, and then there's the IT team. And so they're not really sure in what instance who can actually isolate that machine, or who can actually go to Active Directory and disable that account. That's a process risk. And these are all identified by different types of penetration testing in different specialties. When these risks are identified, there needs to be a way to assess them. How bad is it? The common ways that you see to do this is, of course, a CVSS, Common Vulnerability Scoring System. This is the one that is both a quantitative measure, so you do get like a number scoring from a scale of 0 to 10. But depending on what that quantitative score is, that can translate into a qualitative score of, critical, high, medium, low, informational, etc. And that's the big way that you see technical and process risks communicated, is through CVSS. Another one that's not spoken about too much is the exploit probability scoring system. So this is relatively new. The EPSS uses AI data models in an attempt to add some context to that vulnerability. So, for example, the example I use all the time is a technical issue called SMB signing not enabled. Now, Nessus or many other automated tool sets classify this as medium. But if I'm an attacker and I'm on your internal network, I can, without credentials, without any other prior knowledge really of your network, I can man in the middle a connection between one machine and another, and because SMB signing is not enabled, I could then man in the middle of that connection and gain access to that host, because there's no signing. There's no way for the receiving host to validate that, yes, this is indeed the right person who should be initiating this connection. That's a medium vulnerability, but time and time again, on internal network penetration tests, we gain access to machines constantly with it, and it's a very easy tactic to execute. And it'll get you access without credentials, without anything. It'll get you access to that host. And so that's one of the downfalls of CVSS, is it doesn't necessarily take into account that contextual. So CVSS does have environmental scoring, but it doesn't really take into account that contextual environment, where the EPSS does. And the EPSS can look at historical data and say, what has actually been exploited. And using different AI data models and things like that, it can then create a probability score, which it does. So one that I would recommend that you definitely take a look at. It's relatively new. I mean, it's been around for a few years, but a lot of these standards just take a couple years to even start to gain some steam. But I would highly recommend that you look into the EPSS. It's not, nothing should be, it should be a piece of the greater puzzle, right? Nothing should be the be all end all. CVSS should not be. We'll get a medium issue with SMB signing, just like EPSS cannot be the be all end all. The other thing that you should consider when you're assessing these risks and their potential impact or technical controls you have in place. So the example that I give often is, there's still quite a bit of medical systems that require Windows 7 or Windows Vista or something like that. It's true. There's quite a like old MRI machines and things like that, and even some specialized like microscopes and things like that require Windows Vista or 7 or some outdated version of Windows. And so at the core, if you looked at that and you just use a straight CVSS score, which is critical, right? Because in that case, technically Microsoft doesn't support it any longer. That piece of software is end of life. And so that's critical, because it's not supported. Who knows if there's vulnerabilities? That's a critical issue. So that would be listed as a critical. But what you see in these medical networks is that they will totally isolate that machine. So it either doesn't have internet access, maybe it does have internet access, but even if it does, it's on its own network segment. And oftentimes it's not even directly wired to the rest of the network, but it's been segmented off, it's been isolated. And so if that host was to get infected, chances are not likely that it would spread, extremely unlikely, I'll say, that it would spread to the rest of the network. On top of that, there's a business case for this piece of equipment. The business requires it to function. This is a main part of their business. They can't just stop using it. It's required. They have to use this piece of equipment. This piece of equipment requires this outdated operating system. They have to keep it. They can't just get rid of it and say, all right, we're done. They can't. So when you're assessing risk and the impact of that risk, use the CVSS, use the EPSS, consider the technical controls that are in place, and then depending on your risk appetite, either accept the risk or move forward. But that's really how you should be assessing risk. And I kind of beat on this a little bit already, but CVSS is not the single source of truth. This is what we pretty much just talked about. It's not the single source of truth. You should be using it as a piece of the rest of your, you should be using it as a piece when you assess risk and potential impact. So I'll move through a little quicker here. I know we're almost running out of time. We've got about 15 minutes left, but I did want to talk quickly about mitigating risk. The number one way to mitigate a risk is having a proper vulnerability management program. So often, organizations, and I've been guilty of this too, I think we all have, you get results from a penetration test or some other assessment that you do, but you have these lists of technical and maybe their process risks. But in the case of technical risks, they either sit on a shelf or they're forgotten about, or nothing happens. And the reason that happens is because there's no clear process in place to deal with them. The information security managers or the people that are receiving these technical risks simply don't have a process in place to deal with these issues that come up. And so the proper way to do that is by having a vulnerability management program that should allow you to track the status of it. Is it in progress? Is it open? Is it closed? What is it? That allows you to work with your change management program. So if fixing one particular vulnerability requires that you upgrade a piece of software to a new major version, that should work with change management, and that change should be inventoried in some way. It should track how long it took you to remediate that vulnerability. So when was it discovered? When was it actually closed, right? And one of the big things is that a vulnerability management program should be able to communicate the RACI. So who's responsible for it, right? Who's accountable for it? Who needs to be communicated about it, and who should be informed, right? So really being able to communicate that RACI is a big part of a vulnerability management program, rather. There are options to simply mark something as risk accepted. In the case of that outdated Windows OS system, maybe you mark that as an accepted risk, but you need to be able to justify this to auditors and regulators and maybe even clients, right? Who knows? But you need to be able to justify why you're accepting that risk. In that case, you say, no, we're accepting this risk because it is a business critical asset that cannot be upgraded, but we have put in XYZ controls to mitigate this risk. So that's an option as well, which you will see organizations simply mark a particular risk as risk accepted. So cool. So I think we talked through quite a bit here, talking about what penetration testing is, how the relationship that it has with compliance, regulations, the relationship that it has with risk management. And so, we talked through quite a bit of information here. One thing that I would like to call out specifically is continuous penetration testing, and why and how it helps you reduce that compliance lift and better secure the organization. So a continuous penetration testing engagement goes for 12 months or longer. And it's typically a holistic approach, right? So you can think of continuous testing as a extended red team engagement or extended adversarial emulation engagement over the course of 12, 24, 36 months. In our case, we're acting like real threat actors, and we are looking at in every part of the organization all the time, right? So that means that we're performing a reconnaissance on the organization. That means that we're always looking at web applications for the organization. We're always looking for new threats. So if we know, for example, that there's an Exchange server somewhere and a new Exchange vulnerability occurs, we can then, depending on your preference, we can either first try to exploit it and then let you know about it, or immediately tell you, hey, this particular vulnerability is being exploited in the wild. You have this particular host, you should know about this, right? But it's a always on extended engagement to where, the penetration testers and the consultants are acting like real world threat actors who are continually scanning the internet for new assets. So if you see one of the items there is asset management and discovery. What are threat actors going to do if they want to target your organization? They're going to discover all of the assets that you have publicly facing, and they're going to start looking at those to see if they can find a way in. So continuous testing provides, a holistic approach to this, because if we're acting like threat actors, this allows us to combine information in different ways. So continuous testing can provide an asset inventory for you, right? Continuous testing could provide attack surface management for you, and it includes all these 5 main areas that I've highlighted here. It includes vulnerability management. So it allows you, again, these are extended engagements that are 12, 24, 36 months long. All the data is going to be tracked over time, which means that all the vulnerabilities are going to be tracked over time. So continuous testing also would include vulnerability management. So it really is just like an extended red team engagement that provides a wealth of information to you that you can use in various other ways. And so the other benefit is that instead of a traditional pen test, which is 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever it is, it's continuous. It's not just a snapshot in time, and that means that because if you think about the organization, especially with cloud, right? There's new infrastructure being stood up at all times. So a penetration test in March probably is not going to find the same issues in, say, August, right? Because maybe there's different infrastructure, maybe there's different settings, whatever it might be. Traditional pen testing is just a snapshot in time. Continuous is always on, right? It can serve as a penetration test for compliance purposes at any point. So oftentimes, if you're ISO certified or PCI or whatever it might be, but you have some sort of compliance requirement to perform penetration testing, how many times do we forget about it until the end of the calendar year? And then we're rushing, or we're struggling to make sure that we fit it into that time box that we were supposed to hit. Continuous testing, it's always on, right? So with us, you would get monthly reports, but it can fulfill that compliance requirement at any time. It includes built-in remediation validation. So if we discover an issue, we report on it, we give you mitigation recommendations. You can bet that we're going to look next month, next week, next year, whatever it is, we're going to look and say, hey, is that still there? Because what would a real threat actor do? A real threat actor would look and see if it's possible that it's still there, right? And so the other one, which I kind of mentioned before, it identifies new threats as they arise. So if we have a asset inventory of your assets, which is part of the beginning of continual pen testing. So if you think about how threat actors operate, they first perform reconnaissance. And so as part of that reconnaissance, we generate that asset inventory. And so again, if we know that you have an exchange host and there's a new exchange bug being exploited in the wild, we can alert you instantly and say, hey, there's this brand new exchange bug. We know you have an exchange server here. You need to do something about it right away, right? So there's lots of benefits of continuous testing. And if you want more information on that, please let me know. So the last item that I like to talk about is how Risk 360 can help. So we just talked quite a bit about continuous penetration testing. We also offer network, web pen testing, cloud penetration testing, various services, which I'm sure you're familiar with. If you're not, or if you're interested, please feel free to reach out to me or go to our website and hit the contact us form. But we are, we've dedicated our professional careers to this, and we take it very seriously. And I believe we have an excellent team here at Risk 360 to perform these types of services. We do follow the penetration testing execution standard, which is an industry standard framework for penetration testing. So that is a 7-step process, but it can essentially be boiled down into 3 primary sections: scoping and planning. It's where we talk about, okay, what exactly would you like us to look at? When would you like us to look at it? Do we need credentials? How can you get us those credentials, right? So it's really talking about the logistics of the testing itself. Of course, then after we do the scoping and planning, we perform what at Risk 360 we refer to as field work. We perform the actual penetration testing. And that's where we perform the vulnerability scanning, we look at misconfigurations, and then we attempt to exploit any vulnerabilities that we believe might be present. And then the big part of it, which again, I think it's overlooked quite often, is the reporting. So the reporting is where we verify false positives, where we really find detailed recommendations and mitigation plans for you, and put that in a deliverable for you to actually take a look at these technical risks and give you a plan forward to fix them. So this is all managed through Phalanx, which Phalanx GRC is our online platform that our clients use to interact with us when it comes to the different penetration tests that we offer and that we execute for them. So if you haven't heard about Phalanx, I would definitely recommend you do. If you just go to phalanxgrc.com, you can learn more about that. So, and with that, I think that's all we have for today. I'd like to see, Corey, do you think, do we have any questions?
Corey, we have a couple. Guys, if you have any questions, please feel free. We only have 4 minutes left, so we'll try to get through as many as possible. So the first one, I think you just answered. They were wondering, like, how will they get in touch with us to get the ball rolling for any pen testing that they would need. And, I think you already articulated. Please just go to risk360.com. You actually read more about it in that section of the website for Renegade Labs, and just click the contact us button. It'll start the process, and we'll follow up with you and schedule some time to meet with you. The next question that we have, let me make sure I have it up correctly. All right. In terms of continuous testing, what is the best practice for integrating regular pen tests into an organization's overall risk management strategy? And it's the two-parter. So how often should these tests be conducted, and what factors should be considered when determining the frequency?
So continuous penetration testing is typically, as I mentioned, it's always on. So it's always occurring. Which means that typically our engagements will be a 12, 24, 36-month engagement. And once that engagement starts, we are always operating, right? So we're constantly attacking, we're constantly looking for new infrastructure. We are executing social engineering campaigns or whatever it might be, maybe even physical pen test campaigns. But it's always on, right? We're acting like threat actors against your organization 24/7. The deliverables are monthly. So when I think I'm answering this question correctly. So when it comes to how it applies to risk management, those deliverables are monthly. So what you would do is, you would take any findings that we have for continuous testing, you would take those findings and add them to your risk register or your vulnerability management platform or whatever it might, however you're tracking those items. But you would basically get a monthly report with all of those risks classified, recommendations and mitigation strategies and that kind of thing. I think I answered the question. Does that sound right, Corey?
Yeah, I think you answered it correctly. The next question is, can you provide any examples or any case studies that we can find that where penetration testing has helped organizations identify and mitigate significant risks leading to a better security posture? So I guess
sure.
It's like examples of how it's worked in the past.
What was that, Corey? Examples of what?
I think it's just like an example or two of like how pen testing has helped companies in the past.
Sure. So I have Exchange on my mind right now because I just used that twice as an example. But I think if you want to see any public write-ups on how penetration testing has helped an organization mitigate a risk before it occurred, I would suggest that you simply just Google proxy logon. It's an Exchange vulnerability that occurred probably 2 years ago now at this point. But that was a situation where I know in our case, we did perform a penetration test and we did identify proxy. So this was continuous testing. We did identify a host that was vulnerable to proxy logon and immediately notified the client, and they immediately took that down. And so while one of their subsidiaries also had Exchange, but was not performing continuous testing. They also had an Exchange box, which was exploited. I think the day after we alerted our client about it. So our client was able to mitigate that risk immediately, and they were not affected by that bug because of the continuous testing. Whereas their subsidiary, who wasn't performing continuous testing, actually got exploited by that. If you Google proxy logon Exchange, what's the word I'm trying to think of? Incident response. You should come across a couple that show that the penetration testing identified it before it was actually exploited.
All right, thank you, Corey. Actually, it's the last question that we have. So thank you, Corey, for the great contact. Corey appreciates Corey, and I appreciate everybody for attending today. And a follow-up email will be coming out tomorrow with the recording, so you can share with your colleagues. And if you missed it, it will be on YouTube. So this is for our YouTube guys. It will be on YouTube next week, and you should be able to get any of the downloads that was covered there on the YouTube channel as well. So you guys have a good day. Appreciate your time today.